Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much once again for joining us for Publicate 2020. We've got a really exciting event for you this evening. We'll be talking to Tice Cin from Tilted Axis Press. Tilted Axis are a really special publisher to me. They've been, the first book they published back in 2015, a book called Panti by Nandita Padala, was kind of the book that got me interested in independent publishing, and so I'm very grateful to be talking to them this afternoon. So I believe Tice has just come into the room, so I'm going to try and bring her into the conversation. Let's see if that works. It's always a risk. Let's see.
Hi.
Hi, Tice, how are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. Nice to meet you like this. We've been
nice
emailing.
to meet you properly. Yeah, I'm Joe.
Hi, Tice.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me. Yeah, the team are quite excited about this.
Oh, really? That's good.
Yeah,
That makes me feel good, and slightly more nervous, obviously.
Oh no, it's all good. It's gonna be nice. It started nice, so it will be.
At least I'm at home, so it's, that will make things easier.
Comfier.
Yeah. So just to start with, in case anyone watching doesn't necessarily know, who are Tilted Axis Press and what is it that you do?
So Tilted Axis Press are an independent publisher, and we publish Asian literature and translation, usually by writers who are coming from an angle that's a bit more experimental. We like to publish works that feel, I suppose where we like to be author-led with what we publish. So we're very curious from before the book's even been written. We really love it when authors approach us with a good idea, and likewise with translators as well. So yeah, I would say that we're generally radical feminist press, not to overuse the word radical.
I'd say you're fairly radical press. And so, and what's your role at Tilted Axis?
So I'm community manager, and my job is often stuff like this. So book clubs, festivals, just non-author related events, and I also do all the socials for Tilted Axis. So the Instagram, the Facebook, the Twitter.
Cool. And so I'd like to know kind of what is the criteria that Tilted Axis have for choosing a manuscript when it arrives?
I think every different work that we publish has a different story, and I think that's particularly the case with independent publishers. Sometimes it will be through conversation with a translator. So Deborah, our founder Deborah, for example, she will often meet translators directly at different events. She lived in Korea for a long time, for example, so that's how she met a lot of authors and translators that we work with currently. And it's also a case of sometimes we will hear of a book that's been published in and been received quite well elsewhere, and we'll want to bring it to the UK, I suppose, just to help broaden its reach. So sometimes it's reputation, sometimes it's word of mouth. We're thinking of opening up to call outs every now and then too, as our team grows. We're still quite a small team.
And so you say that sometimes you'll kind of hear the reputation of a book that's going on elsewhere. Will you then have to pair that book with a translator? And what's that process there?
So, for example, Jae Lee, who is the translator for Unexpected Vanilla, that's coming out very soon, they discovered that book and Lee Raimi's writing through doing a translation workshop and finding one poem about kink that they really thought was amazing, and they then came to Tilted Axis after putting it together with all that enthusiasm, and I think that's that's like the main way we like to do things, where we know that the translator and author pairing are very comfortable. And I think on the note of not wanting to feed into like imperialist notions of translation, we like as much as possible to have authors who are writing in, translators who are ideally native language speakers. We really love English as a second language translators. And I think that there's a strange aversion to that in a lot of translations. There's this cultural hegemony that expects people to, be an English as a first language speaker, and therefore they will only be, they're the only people that can be translators. So we try to avoid that with who we work with. So yeah, I'd say a lot of it's author and translator led in terms of their relationships with one another and how keen they are to work with one another.
It's something that kind of drew me to Tilted Axis to begin with, and something I've enjoyed throughout reading all of your books, is that I feel like you kind of celebrate translation as an art form in and of itself. Would you agree that that's something you try to do?
Definitely. I would like that to just be the status quo. And I mean, what we always say is that translation is a collaboration. It's not a, it's not a conversion. It's a collaboration. It's a conversation. There are choices being made, and I think that the sensitivity and creativity that requires, of course, is art. And also there are so many translators who are writers, and I think that the two skills, they love one another.
Yeah, that's a nice way of putting it. And something I've wondered is, do you ever kind of, because you publish books from quite a wide range of Asian countries, do you ever, as an organisation, kind of have a place in mind before you find a book from that place? Like, would you, for instance, think like, we've never published a Cambodian writer, so let's go to Cambodia and find some writing from there? Or is it always just author-led?
It's not usually geo-specific in that way. And if it is, we like to go with partners. So with translating Feminisms, we have a chapbook coming out that's from the Philippines called Paliwanag. And we're partnering with Gantala Press to put that chapbook together. And I think that you can tell when you read it that it's less of an external curiosity and more a project that's been built with immediate connections and networks, both on site and here. I think that's also another factor of the fact that so many members of the team are dotted about the world. With our Korean titles, that might be reflected with what we published, because Deborah lived in Korea. So to some extent, it has an impact, but not with.
Yeah. And so I want to kind of touch on something that you mentioned earlier, and you mentioned in the in your kind of mission statement on your website, is that you kind of draw influence for your practice from the impact, the kind of continuing impact of British colonialism on writers living in and from other countries. How can you elaborate on that slightly? How is it that is informing your practice?
Well, we could give, for example, we pay our translators and authors the same rate that we would no matter where they live. And I think that a lot of publishers don't do that. They assume that because living costs are lower elsewhere, that they don't need to have, a fee, a flat fee across things. And I think things like that really make a difference. And we're trying to do better. There are things that we can't necessarily control that we're aware of. So, for example, with copyright for a book, how it will say like UK and Commonwealth, and the way that affects how books are published, for example, in Australia, because it may not be that the web, I suppose, or publicity is continuing in a way that's most helpful and buoyant for the book that we're working with. So I think those are things that there are things that we're trying to, that we actively do ourselves, and then there are things that we're aware of and that we, I think, through our practice, like to talk about and shout about and moan about.
Do you feel like you're kind of fighting against other practices that the industry is kind of used to operating under?
So, for example, when I say other publishers, that even in itself doesn't feel helpful enough, because the industry is small. With many of us have worked at the conglomerates and down to the independents, and it is very small as an industry. But there are some things built into the paperwork of a lot of publishing contracts that I think that we're all still just becoming aware of and trying to unseat.
Yeah.
I hope that answered.
No, it does. It answers it really nicely.
Oh, thank you.
So another thing I'd like to touch on, this is something that anyone who's familiar with your books has probably noticed as well, is you have these absolutely beautiful prefaces at the beginning, in which I don't know whether it's the translator or it's someone from the team will pick a word from the original text or a phrase that, for whatever reason, you're unable to translate the full meaning of that word in English or in the way we understand English. And can you just tell me a bit about that and tell about, is it the translator who puts that together?
It's almost always the translator. Sometimes the author will have a particular word in mind that they want to make sure is brought to the fore. So with Every Fire You Tend by Sema Kaygusiz, that was the word suskunluk, which means I suppose to be made silent. I can speak about that one with a bit more, I suppose, authority because I speak the language. And yeah, there's so much that can't be said easily with suskunluk that is said there. And I really love the way that Nick wrote that. Nick Glastonbury, the translator. I think that they help. What I love about those prefaces is that it also sets up the reader to know that what they're about to read is a translation, and there are things that are going to be missed, and it's important to be aware of that throughout as you're reading. And I think that it means that we read a bit more critically and with a bit more of, I suppose, a deep eye.
Yeah. And it gives some space between the original text and the translation, if that makes sense. And I think there's a tendency for people to expect translation to feel invisible and feel that this thing in the English we're reading is the text that it is. And that's something that I love that you don't do. You draw attention to that.
Thank you.
I want to talk about one of your authors. I mentioned at the beginning of the video, Nandita Padala, who wrote Panti and Abandon and Yogini, and Panti was the first book of yours that I read. Can you talk at all about your relationship with her?
So the way that she talks about feminism really personally inspires me, and like yourself, I think that Abandon was the first Tilted Axis book that I read, and before I even applied for my work at Tilted Axis, I knew that I wanted to work for a company that represented an author like her. What I love about Nandita is the way that she doesn't shy away from sexual perversion or the ways that the philosophies of self and subjectivities and of the body. I think that there are a lot of things that she writes about in her work that I find just like utterly stunning, and also I go off in an existential crisis right afterwards. I'm just like, what is this? What is life? Especially like I think the way that she writes about responsibility and how much we can relinquish responsibility while still maintaining morality. That's something that I think is very pertinent to a lot of the literature that we know and love. I think that balance between morality and responsibility.
And is there is there ever likely to be more in the works from her through you guys?
She has so many books that she's written.
That's like 9, I think, something like that. Like
I think that there are even more. I was talking to her recently, like a couple months ago, because she's just written an essay for us that I'm trying to place at the moment, and it was interesting because, for example, the Yogini, she wrote that in the 90s, and it's aged really well. I would say, like, you can tell that it's. I mean, it's when I say aged really well, I think it feels fresh. You can also tell that it was written when it was, in a good way. But I think I'm really interested about some of the newer works that she's working on, because I think there's a lot of conversation between our books. But I haven't read anything that she's written like over the last year, for example, which I'd really like to see.
And that, yeah. See, I didn't realise that's when the Eugene was originally written. I assumed that because it was the third one that you published. I thought it was a newer work, but it is, yeah, it has stood up remarkably well in that sense.
Yeah, I think it was the late 90s. Many apologies if I'm wrong, but yeah, it was definitely at least 15 years ago.
I think another. Sorry, I've wanted to avoid this becoming just me talking about all the books I love, but I do want to mention The Impossible Fairy
No,
Tale.
that's amazing. That's why we were particularly keen to chat with you.
Yeah,
More enjoyable.
Yeah, I mean, if I had the time and the energy, I would spend all evening talking about them. But Impossible Fairy Tale is sensational, absolutely sensational, and again has really detailed translators' notes, and it kind of talks specifically about this, the fact that Korean is a pictorial language, and that the author, how you say, kind of manipulated that in her writing of it. Is there anything you can tell us about the process of bringing that book to publication?
That book was before my time.
Okay.
But what I can say about all of the Korean titles that we worked with is they were probably the hardest. Not for us, but I would say Korean into English there are so many things. There are so many like opposites taking place. So I think it's particularly interesting because she's very experimental with her writing, and so I wish I'd been around at the time, because I like seeing how Unexpected Vanilla, the poetry that we've got coming out soon, seeing that process. I can imagine that this was similarly interesting.
Yeah.
With how it, I suppose, required a lot of changes that were artistic choices.
Yeah.
As all translations do, but I think particularly so with that title.
Yeah, I think there was some kind of big chunks that had to be rewritten to make logical sense in English. And so you mentioned the collections coming up. You haven't you published Indigenous Bodies years ago, but you've recently kind of stepped up your poetry publications. How has that process been different? Is it a dramatically different translation process with poetry?
I wouldn't say that it was dramatically different. I think that when we do our in-house editing, that can feels refreshing. It's a different brain, so it's nice to see like members of the team. I think that, for example, with the copy edits, where I think we're learning more about copy editing poetry and how you don't publish the lines running over and things like this. So there are more like structural things that we're bearing in mind, but it's also like we're finding new audiences with our poetry where we might not have had them in the same way before. The poetry community is so different. Also, apologies, I think my laptop was making a really loud noise.
It was fine, I couldn't hear a thing.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, the poetry different community in the UK is very tight knit, and there's not a lot of emphasis on translated literature. That's something that I was very keen on with my own like career trajectory. So I used to work at the Poetry Translation Centre, and I think starting there helped me to see all the opportunities for where different programs and different organisations could collaborate more. And it also introduced me to modern poetry and translation. I love them as a company. So I think for us, translating poetry means new friends and new people to like sit it up to and be like, hey, we wrote this.
Look at this poem, it's really nice.
Yeah.
Do you find that do you have kind of like different will people who translate fiction generally not touch poetry and vice versa, or do you find translators are kind of keen to pounce on poetry?
I've always found that translators are like work across so many different mediums, and it will be that they will take a break between forms.
Yeah.
And that will be more what will happen. So like from what I've like there are like a lot of people that enjoy having poetry to translate, and then they'll switch to prose, and then they'll do a bit of like outside translating for smaller projects, like essays and stuff like this. So I would say that it's I haven't really met that myself personally with the translators that we've worked with. They're very I suppose broad with what they are intrigued by.
Okay, so there's another project of yours that I want to draw attention to, and just if you could give us a bit more information on. There's a project called Translating Feminisms. What can you tell us about this?
So Translating Feminisms was one of the chapbooks that I waved at you. So we did our first Kickstarter for this series, I think 2 years ago, and the remit for it was I think that the translation can feel so slow, and so we wanted to put out smaller works that I suppose introduced people to poets who should be heard about and who we'd like to continue to publish, or we would like others to publish. We wanted to like start small where we could with a Kickstarter, because we haven't had it in budget. And the remit mainly has been finding women and non-binary writers who want to write without being told what to write, I think. So we've had guest curators for every single chapbook, and we've been very hands-off with it in terms of like the stories and what's being told within. And I think that's something that our team is very passionate about, just making sure that for regions that we're not familiar with and for areas that we're not specialists in, that we invite the specialists in and we pay them their proper fee. And that's why we were asking for funding with this series. We're doing Translating Feminisms 2 now, and it's just a helping hand, I suppose, that we're asking for to make something that's quite ambitious come to life. The series, this iteration of the series is a chapbook from Indonesia. That's called Deviant Disciples, and that's Intan Paramadita, and she's the editor and curator behind this chapbook. And it's got like amazing poets within, like Shinta Febriani, who she's a theatre maker and like and she writes about the body in a really like shocking way, and raving and like those mates that gossip about you and you just want to tell them to shut up. So like there are like, I don't know, it's just really relatable poems. You know, like Fake Friends and Raven. I think I'm making a little film at the moment with one of Shinta's poems, so I'll be able to share that soon. But yeah, we're really excited. And then the other chapbook, Pawiliawanag, you know, that one too, it's got so much such a broad range of voices from across the Philippines, and Gantala Press, I think what I particularly love about them is that they collaborate a lot with charities and smaller organisations to put on events and to, like they release cookbooks from a feminist lens. And I think their work is so specific with how they want to have like an amazing feminist outreach. And we're really lucky to be working with them. It's Faye Cura, who's one of the editors there, is a really inspiring person. And yeah, I'm queuing a bit. I'm a bit of a fangirl, I'm realising, but but yeah, it's just amazing to work with so many people who are confronting a white feminist gaze. But just by being, and just by like, none of that is being put into the curation. It's so liberating that it's very sometimes my English expression, but like it's very free from that, I suppose. I couldn't find the word.
And when do you think, in terms of the timeline, when do you think then that next book's going to be out with us?
So we're 55% in our Kickstarter, and we're hoping, our goal is to have them printed by the end of November so that everyone can get them on time for the holidays.
Cool.
I mean, we've given ourselves a good amount of time for that.
Yeah.
I think.
And I don't think any of us are ever going to get a more impassioned sales pitch than that. I think that's, so there'll be a link to Tilted Access's website in the Publicate bio for anyone who's watching, and there's also links to the Kickstarter in there as well. It's a really, really exciting project. Are you able to tell us anything about other projects, the new books coming out for the autumn?
We have a book called, I wish I had a copy of it on me actually, because it's so beautiful, the cover. It's got this like really meticulous feather across the cityscape. It's Strange Beasts of China by Yang Ge, and that's translated by Jeremy Jiang, and it's really cool. It's I don't know how to pronounce this, bestiary. It's a creative bestiary. So it takes you through like stories about different animals, or horrific animals, but through with a modern twist. It's really quirky. And then I have one here, which is publishing on the 10th of September. So that's No Presents, Please. And these stories, it's by Diane Kokini. And we're really excited to be working with Kannada, because it's a language that is shockingly underrepresented. And these short stories have a wonderful reputation. A lot of the writers that we know and love are really they're big fans of them, because it's been published elsewhere in like snippets and all this. So we're really looking forward to that one coming out. What else have we got? Unexpected Vanilla, which I mentioned a little bit earlier. That is one of my favourite titles from TAP. It's lots of fluids, it's lots of like oozing palms and like mouths that are like erupting into tidal waves kind of thing, and it's just like really surreal, bold poetry, and quite clean as well. I do love good clean poetry where it's very like it's quite sharp hitting. My background's in poetry, so it's like that's my soft spot.
That's great. Tija, I'm going to have to start wrapping it up if that's okay, but thank you so much for doing this with us. It's, yeah, for me especially, just to sit and chat about TAP books is brilliant. And I hope
thank you so much for your enthusiasm. It's really refreshing. It's lovely.
Oh no, you're welcome. There's plenty more to come, don't worry. So yeah, as I said before, links to Tilted Access Press will be in Publicate bio. And yeah, please get on translating Feminisms. It's a really important project to be supporting. So I'll say goodbye. That was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good evening. Bye.
Thank you.
Good evening, everyone.